Hello and welcome to Radio K number 8. I'm Adam Cadre. We have a packed program today, so let's get to it. First up, we have Claire Parker Fisher to talk with me about Necrotic Drift by Rob Sherwin. So, how familiar were you with Rob Sherwin stuff before playing this?
Not at all.
Okay, well, I have to admit that I was kind of skittish about this one and wanted to make sure that it didn't go to a brand new guest, just in case, because Rob Sherwin's calling card back in the day was a game called Chicks Dig Jerks, which is not for everyone. It starts you off as a pickup artist hitting on a series of women at a singles bar, and then there are some long cutscenes, and then you're off grave robbing.
Okay.
It wasn't very popular. It came in 31st out of 37, mainly because of the content, I figure, but partly because it was pretty buggy, and partly because of the way that most of the time you type something, bam, like a whole page of text. But there were a few people who defended it, and I was actually one of those. I thought the writing was uneven, but even if it wasn't as solid all the way through as the writing in a lot of other games, its ceiling was a lot higher. Like, even within sentences that were pretty crude overall or just didn't work, there would be these turns of phrase that were just phenomenal. Like, here's a piece of dialogue that I liked, and this comes from a pretty tame bit, just so that nobody has to tune out. One character is asked a question about Eastern Europe, and he replies, "The hell would I know? My entire archive of knowledge of that area of the world is solely based on the background screens in the Spectrum holobyte version of Tetris." And yeah, maybe the beginning of that piece of dialogue is a little overwritten, but the concept of the joke is hilarious. And what really impressed me was that Rob knew that what makes the joke is the reference to Spectrum holobyte. Because, one, there's that shock of recognition that, yeah, it's really obscure, but I knew exactly what he was talking about. I remember those background screens very well. And two, Spectrum holobyte as a name is, by a happy coincidence, exactly funny enough to work in that spot. It's not too silly, and it's not too plain, and it's even got exactly the right number of syllables. Anyway, so that was 1999, and even in the short time that I was still following IF after that, Rob released a bunch of games. In 2000, he entered the comp again with a buggy superhero game called A Crimson Spring, and the year after that, he teamed up with Mike Souza on a comp game called No Time to Squeal, and at the exact same time, he put out a longer game called Fallacy of Dawn. And it looks like, after that, his next release was this one from 2004, Necrotic Drift, which was nominated for 8 Zizzy Awards, including Best Game. You play Jarrett Duffy, a Dungeons & Dragons expert who makes $5.51 an hour working at the mall in a dystopian helltown called New Haz. You can tell it's dystopian because it's 2015, and yet video stores still exist. Also, there are these zombie robot things that go on rampages, but that's kind of a secondary consideration. In any case, the big thing going on in your life is that your girlfriend is moving out of state, and it's bringing up some drama, and then the two of you and some other friends get trapped at the mall by a demon, and you have to fight your way past a series of D&D monsters to get out. So, what'd you think?
I'd say I generally enjoyed it. I thought it seemed a little long. The puzzles were not super difficult, but just frustrating enough that there was a lot of time running around the mall and not really accomplishing very much. So when you were kind of between giant text dumps, I sort of didn't really find it very enjoyable. But I thought it had some funny parts, and I definitely enjoyed it overall, I think. I wasn't blown away by it, but I mostly enjoyed the experience.
Yeah, about those text dumps. In the past, I've talked about pieces of IF in which the interactivity is basically just a matter of turning pages. There's generally one thing you're supposed to do to get to the next chunk, and it's just a matter of typing in that command. And that's pretty much the case here. If a monster is attacking you, you have to fight the monster. If a monster is not attacking you, then you have to talk to someone and pick a conversational option. If you're out of conversational options, then the thing to do is to move to another location. But what made Necrotic Drift in particular feel like turning pages is that when you do type in your command, you actually do get a whole page of text. Sometimes more. And it's not just that you type in a cause and see the effect. Rob is trying to tell a story here, with flashbacks that let us learn about the characters and let the characters learn about each other, and that's great. But when those sorts of things are the response to typing in the command go north, you can wonder whether you're really affecting anything.
Yeah, so basically, I thought the quality of the writing in the big text dumps was really good overall. There were some funny parts, yeah, it was clever, it was sometimes a little sentimental, it was sometimes a little full of gross out humor or descriptions of monsters or whatever. But then there's these kind of incidental single sentence things that are just part of IF. So the things that the other characters are doing, the things that the monsters are doing, and then the kind of background stuff. And that all kind of just dumps in these kind of single lines at the end of every turn, whether there was a giant text dump or not. And they just seem very, very sparse. So there's a lot of combat, and the combat is generally like the skeleton attacks and hits you, exclamation point. And that is all the skeleton ever does. Maybe sometimes it misses you, but it's these kind of single sentence, really sparse, deeply unrealistic sorts of things. Like a skeleton attacking and hitting you is something that maybe deserves more than those few words. And at first I thought that was just very clumsy, like this was sort of the best that we could implement with an interactiveness, that there was this kind of non-interactive portion, and then when you were interacting it had to be very sparse. But I was actually thinking about it more recently, and that is kind of what playing a computer or a console RPG is like. There's sort of all of this plot stuff, and then there's you fight a monster, and it's basically you just punch each other in the face until one of you falls over. And the kind of realism and the characters and the plot don't matter for that part of it. And the whole game is largely a sort of a tribute to tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. And that's probably really similar, is you have a game master who's designed this big campaign, and maybe they have some character beats, and maybe the players have some important character development that they want to get across, and maybe they have some motivation, and then they run into a monster, and it's just you roll the dice and you see what happens, and then you roll the dice again, you see what happens, and it can't be scripted and it can't really be authored because it's just random chance. So I wasn't sure whether it was that IF and these kinds of games share a design constraint that kind of makes them come out looking the same at the end, or whether it was kind of a deliberate choice, like this is a D&D campaign and there's going to be these character beats and Duffy is going to encounter these certain events, and then there's going to be this combat portion that is a little bit outside of that world, and it's kind of a separate mode of thinking about how a game works.
That's really interesting. I hadn't considered that, but it does make a lot of sense now that I hear it. You know, I was never big into RPGs as a kid, but I did play Champions a little bit, so I am familiar with how they can alternate between the GM reading atmospheric paragraphs out of a handbook, and then the rest of it is just, you punch the villain for 6 hit points and stuff like that. But one thing that I can say for listeners who may not be all that familiar with IF programming is that it's absolutely possible to code up combat sequences that are written in the same style as the story text. You know, it's not a memory constraint, and it's not a limitation of the programming languages. You just have to be willing to put in the work.
Yeah, so that's what made me start to think that it wasn't just Sherwin being inexperienced or not knowing how to do it, because he's clearly got some polish in a programming sense. And so that's what made me start to think that it was a deliberate parallel to tabletop gaming.
Yeah, could be. Though, it wasn't just the combat sequences that were like this. A lot of the time you'd get like 4 paragraphs of story, and then the last paragraph would just say, Audrey is here. Casey is here. And again, it's very easy to do better than this. In Hugo, it just means that you add a property called short desk to the character object. Though actually, one problem I encountered was that sometimes the game didn't even bother to tell me when people were around at all. You know, there were a few occasions when I thought I was going off by myself to explore different parts of the mall, only to learn like 10 turns later that the other characters had been following me around the whole time and the game hadn't mentioned that. And there's this one part where your friend Gibbs spits over a railing, but he does this every time you look around, because it was coded as a description rather than an action. Though it turns out that the spitting is actually a clue for a puzzle, which raises the question, what did you think of the puzzle design?
Yeah, I wasn't really that interested in it. There was one that I got fairly stuck on, where I kind of solved it, but I didn't quite solve it in the right way. think it was like the mummy or something. You need to like set him on fire, and that seemed pretty obvious, but I just couldn't quite get him to burn right. You had to like throw the torch at something else, and then it would hit the something else and bounce off it and burn the guy. Something like that. Anyway, I got stuck and I just started using a walkthrough. And yeah, it was mostly kind of either you hit a thing or you like find the object that you need to use correctly. It wasn't really clever enough to like keep me engaged. And I found there was a lot of walking back and forth around this area, trying to sort of make sure you've picked up every little object that might be useful.
Yeah, the about text for this game says that the way to proceed is by alternating conversation and violence, and at first that did seem to be all there was to it. There were a couple of times that it looked like the game was setting up a puzzle, like how to open the locked cabinet to get the silver rings, but then it just flat out tells you what to do. But you mentioned the mummy, and it actually turned out that by the time I reached the mummy, I was in an unsolvable state because I was critically injured, though the only sign that I was critically injured was that it said so when I typed diagnose. But anyway, the reason I was critically injured was that when I fought the skeleton really early on, I just stood there punching it in the face. Or the skull, I guess. And it turned out that I was supposed to use a blunt weapon of some sort. And maybe Jarrett, the D&D expert, already knew that, but I am not a D&D expert, and I didn't know it. And it turns out that you're supposed to hit the skeleton with a crystal ball holder, but the game only says that if you're holding it. If not, then, I don't know, I guess you have to Google it to catch up to your character.
Yeah, I don't know. It seemed like the crystal ball holder was pretty much the only object in an otherwise objectless area. So it seemed pretty obvious to me that you were supposed to use it for something, and hitting the skeleton seemed like the only thing you could do with it. But, you know, I have played RPGs, even if not tabletop RPGs, but computer RPGs kind of inherit the same sort of classes of ideas sometimes. So I might have just known it already.
Actually, I went back to see what kind of clues there were, and it turns out that if you're not already holding the crystal ball holder, the game just says that you need a weapon, and if you already picked up and dropped the crystal ball holder, it does not appear in the room description anymore. So that's not good. And as for the idea that it must be useful because it's mentioned, I actually found that the game was full of red herring objects. Like, I spent most of the game lugging around an Xbox, but I don't think the Xbox is ever useful for anything.
And there were just sort of certain things that I found really frustrating. Like, you find like a bag of blood, which is a really weird thing to find. And then, like, using the bag of blood turns out to be like weirdly complicated, and you sort of have to like have this sort of precognitive skill that you know where you're going to need it, and that you need it to stay cold, so you give it to the cold demon or whatever. And then you can use it at the end, but I just definitely that didn't occur to me at all.
Yeah, I assume that was for distracting the vampire, but the vampire doesn't even notice it.
I definitely did try that, and I was like, well, okay, like, take the blood, vampire, don't eat me. And no reaction.
Speaking of the vampire, I have a specific point I want to make, but before I get to it, I wanted to ask, what do you think of this whole genre?
It's not really a genre I really liked very much, so I haven't really pursued it. Seems like all of the horror I've ever played has relied like heavily on either gross out disgustingness or else on kind of just raw sadism, which is a brand of horror that I really don't have a taste for. I do like horror movies sometimes, but the Saw or Hostel type genre is just like 100% not for me.
Now, I'm not a fan of horror movies, so let me ask, what kind do you like and why?
I guess the horror movies that I think are the most interesting and the most effective are more psychological, that kind of build on dread and sort of not knowing what's going to happen. I'm much less interested in like a serial killer than I am in sort of a person who kind of fears the dark side of their own life. And I just haven't seen that in IF because I just feel like it's very visual in some certain way or very reliant on audio cues. I do also watch sort of horror comedies where it's not really about being scary and it doesn't stick with you. It's mostly about sort of being kind of shockingly amusing, like The Evil Dead 2, which is basically just absurdness. You know, there's nothing that really sits with you the night after you watch that. And so I was sort of wondering whether this game kind of wanted to be a horror movie, which is the sort of thing that stays with you and you think about it and it gets under your skin. or if it's just trying to be sort of goofy and funny and shocking, like sort of horror comedy movies.
Okay, now this is bringing up all sorts of things. There are about 3 different threads that I want to follow here, but I guess the first is this. You said that the kind of horror you are into is audio-visual, and one of the distinctive features of Necrotic Drift is that it does come with pictures and music. I actually forgot that for a second because I turned the music off right away because I just don't have the kind of brain that lets me read and listen to music at the same time. Did you keep the music on?
I turned it off pretty quickly. I found it difficult to listen to. I think it's probably not awful all the way through, but I think the amount of interesting free music has definitely increased in the last 10 years, so there could have been better choices. It's hard to listen to on a loop, is what I'll say. You just can't listen to it over and over again without your teeth setting on edge. So I turned it off pretty quickly.
Now, I did play with the pictures on, though the game, or at least the interpreter, couldn't handle the fact that I resized the window, so some of the pictures ended up displaying wrong, like only the left half would show up and stuff like that. But I did see most of the pictures, and I don't know, you mentioned horror comedies, and this does have jokes in it, but the text suggests that we're supposed to take the monsters semi-seriously, and that gets undercut when we can see that they're just Rob Sherwin's friends wearing goofy makeup.
I thought they were kind of sweet. I don't know. I mean, it seemed like it was probably a couple of really fun days for those guys, getting dressed up like zombies and posing in silly ways. I don't think it really added that much for me, but I didn't dislike it. The only thing that would like sometimes happen is you'd get this like image up at the top of the screen, but your eyes hadn't finished reading to like the point where that image was described. It was kind of like almost a little tiny spoiler. I think you could kind of take or leave them, but they were kind of charming.
I will say that I thought the location pictures were pretty effective. I don't always have a very clear mental picture of the stuff I read, but I did come away from this feeling almost like I just watched a movie set at this particular mall. And I wanted to ask you, since most of what I know about horror movies comes from reading scholarly articles about them rather than from actually watching them, my impression is that malls are a pretty classic location for horror movies, particularly zombie movies. Is that right?
Yeah, Dawn of the Dead is a zombie movie about being in the mall, and that was kind of where that comes from. And it has a lot of imagery of the mindless consumer and the zombie as being parallels, and that these zombies have like basically nothing left of humanity, but they do remember that they like to go to the mall. And I think that that kind of imagery sort of stuck around in the zombie genre, that part of what zombies are about is mindlessness and mall culture really go together well.
Yeah, it occurs to me that the 80s were the heyday of horror movies and that the 80s were the heyday of mall culture. So I guess it stands to reason that probably a lot of people in the 80s saw horror movies at the mall.
Probably, yeah.
I know a lot of the movies I saw in the 20th century I saw at one mall or another. Even in the 90s. Like the Brea Mall Cineplex showed a lot of the bigger art films, and South Coast Plaza showed a lot of the really obscure ones. But speaking of the 90s, let me finally make the point I mentioned a little while ago. The one work in the horror genre that I've ever really been into was the TV version of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was thematically very rich. And the same could not be said about most of the games on the last episode of this show. Like Return to Ditch Day and All Things Devours weren't really about much of anything other than their own puzzles. And one of the best things about Necrotic Drift is that it actually is about something. Its central theme is one of the classics, which is, will the man-child grow up? And in this case, it's, will the geeky, underemployed man-child grow up? We learn a lot about this guy's childhood, we get lots of glimpses at various stages of his relationship with Audrey, and so we think that that's what the climax is going to pay off. But instead, Jarrett has this debate with the big level boss demon about whether his friends slowed him down, and Jarrett says, I needed Gibbs's courage. Where would I have been without Audrey's intelligence, Trott's resourcefulness, Casey's willpower? And even if those qualities had been on display, which I don't think they were really, that's not the theme. it was a theme of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You know, throughout the series, there's this running thread about how much Buffy should rely on her friends, given that supposedly she alone is the chosen one. But the value of teamwork is not set up as a theme in Necrotic Drift. So it's kind of bizarre for it to suddenly be given center stage, and then to get dropped again.
Yeah, I agree. And I was sort of wondering how you would implement that, if that was the theme that you really wanted. How would you implement it in a way that was interesting in this kind of solo game? Because if the NPCs, act too independently and Audrey just figures things out and Gibbs fights the monsters, and then that's frustrating. The player kind of wants to be the person who figures things out. And if you do use other characters, you kind of just tend to use them like tools. Like, oh, Gibbs, you clear this away. And then he just is a little automaton who clears stuff away until you've done everything that there is to do in the area that you can get to. And so that seems like a theme that's not really suited to IF. And if it was, I was sort of wondering like how you would do it. Would you have multiple player characters, or could you even have like co-op IF where multiple people can play in the same game? Or is that just too weird? It doesn't seem like a theme that's really suited to IF except as kind of a bunch of flavor text. You could say in some of those text dumps like, oh, Audrey one time figured out this amazing thing, and when you solve the puzzle, maybe she could be the one who actually implements it in some way, even if you were the one who entered the command. And I wasn't really sure if there was supposed to be this teamwork theme all the way throughout and it just didn't come across, or if it was just kind of a thing at the end that didn't really tie in.
Well, somewhere in the IF archive is a starter file I wrote for people who wanted to create multiplayer IF, though I don't think anyone ever really used it. But it occurs to me that on top of everything that you just mentioned, it's a little odd to have trust in your friends as a theme in IF, because your friends are NPCs. The message that you should recognize that these people are as fully human and capable as yourself doesn't really work when they're not, when they're just snippets of code.
Uh-huh.
Now, in talking about all this, I've been a little sloppy about how I use the word you, because, of course, there's the player, who is a human, and the player character, who's made of code just like the NPCs are. And in Necrotic Drift, the player character is actually almost as limited as those NPCs. One thing that made this game feel like it was on rails was the fact that when Audrey says she wants you to move to Texas with her, saying yes isn't an option. You can either say no with one joke, or you can say no with another joke. And that's basically how all the conversations work. You get a choice, but it's like those online polls where the options are no and hell no. So the character arc is always the same.
That sort of thing never really bothers me that much. I actually think it's kind of more interesting to have a character who's a character rather than a character who's a nobody that you're sort of moving around. So that didn't really bother me, and trying to develop like multiple emotionally satisfying arcs, one where you've agreed to go to Houston and then you get trapped in the mall, and one where you can't imagine that kind of life for yourself and you get trapped in the mall would be very difficult. There's sort of a whole modern set of games, these sort of choice-based adventure games where, you can decide to do X or you can decide to do Y, but it's kind of ultimately a braiding structure where no matter what you choose, you have to wind back up at the same place because they can't make infinite branches that go out in different directions. They can't diverge too much. That doesn't really bother me, especially when, so much of what's going on are these big text dumps with these big flashbacks, and I don't really know what his motivations are until they tell me, so any choice I made would be essentially just me thinking, well, I think that he ought to do this, because that's what people should do, and not, well, this is a choice that would make an interesting story.
Well, here's my take. You say that accounting for multiple emotionally satisfying arcs is difficult, and you're absolutely right about that. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that it's difficult. Making something really good usually is difficult. So, yeah, I'm familiar with that braiding structure that you talked about. I've even seen guides to writing interactive stories that talk about how, oh, you have no alternative but to come up with a braiding structure, or you'll have to do all this work. But it seems to me that there is an alternative. And that alternative is to do the work. It's easier said than done, but You look at something like Galatea, where Emily Short actually did the work, and you see the payoff. And Rob Sherwin clearly put a ton of work into Necrotic Drift, but it seems like it was mostly storytelling work and not so much about the interactivity. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. I mean, I'd rather have that than the other way around. But, like I said early on, it does make for an experience that feels a little bit like you're just turning pages. So there are still 2 games from my 2004 list that we have yet to cover. Both of them are superhero games. The first is Future Boy by Kent Tessman, which we won't be covering at all because it was a commercial game, and it turns out that it's no longer available. Which is too bad because Kent Tessman is one of the funniest people I've ever met, and I was looking forward to that one. The second game is Luminous Horizon by Paul O'Brien, which we will be covering as soon as possible, but the original guest had some issues, so rather than keep you waiting any longer, we're just going to dive into a couple of games from 2005, starting with Tough Beans by Sarah D. And if you're thinking that none of this explains why on earth we had an interlude of opera a minute ago, you're right. That is because my guest for this segment is Stacey Tappan, and what you heard is what she sounds like when she's not wasting her beautiful voice talking to me. So, let's meet Stacey.
I'm a professional opera singer, but in my spare time, I enjoy playing games because they don't require me to use my voice. I first got into IF in the late 80s with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game because I had read the book and I had seen the Infocom games at the computer store, and we owned a Macintosh, and those were some of the best looking games available to play on the Macintosh at that time. Most of the really cool games were only available for PC. And I liked the humor in it. I liked the creativity of it. It enabled me to kind of get more into the world of the book, which I really was fond of. And I played a couple of the other games. I played Bureaucracy and Leather Goddesses of Phobos. And then I had pretty much exhausted all the comedy Infocom IF, and it kind of fell by the wayside as I went off to school. And then I stumbled across the Lost Treasures of Infocom, which had all of the major Infocom games. And I was like, great, I can play it on my new computer. And this was, do you know when this was that came out?
I do. Lost Treasures 1 was 91, and Lost Treasures 2 was 92. And I remember this because 92 was the same year Star Control 2 came out, which I really wanted to buy. And the only computer game store that I knew of was at a mall 30 miles away. And being stupid, instead of looking up a closer one, I just drove all the way down there. And then it turned out that Star Control 2 was delayed. And I thought, I came all this way, I'm buying something. And I saw Lost Treasures 2 and I thought, yeah, I'll get that. I remember those Infocom games from when I was a kid, and maybe now I'm old enough to be able to get something out of them.
Mm-hmm. But playing Hitchhikers early on really sort of informed all of my game choices going forward. I was really into Myst, which is also a puzzle sort of object game, and Monkey Island, all of those types of games in which you find objects and do things with them to solve puzzles. So finding Lost Treasures of Infocom inspired me to go out looking to see if there was any more, because since they'd re-released them, maybe there was an interest. And that's when I found the IF writing community and started hanging out and playing people's games. And I was hanging out in the IF mud just to kind of talk to people and get a sense of what was out there. And I told you this before, I feel like I was the only non-IF writer on the IF mud. But they were very nice to me, and I learned an awful lot, not only about IF and coding, but just about game construction from them, so that was pretty cool. I got out of the IF community around 2005 just because my career kind of took over, and I have recently gotten back into iOS games where you search for objects and do things with them. They're not quite as complicated as the cool IF games that we used to do, but they have graphics. But I've kind of been feeling a little nostalgia for what got me into IF in the first place.
So you say you lost track of IF in 2005 because your career took over, so Before we rejoin the world of 2005 and talk about Tough Beans, I have to ask, what's it like to be an opera singer?
Like, kind of, it's normal for me, but a lot of people are like, what is that like? And I'm not sure what to say.
I know, it's kind of a weird question. What's it like to be an opera singer? It's like, well, I've never been a construction worker, so...
No, I haven't had a regular job since grad school, so I wouldn't even know how I would do in like an office situation nowadays. But I will say it's tremendously fulfilling to do something that I really, really love. When I sing, I feel like I'm using my body and my talent to its full potential, and that is a wonderful feeling. I feel lucky that I'm able to make a career of it, and I'm grateful for every single opportunity that I get to share it.
Wonderful.
Working as an opera singer is kind of like working as an actor. You get hired per gig, you travel to where the gig is, you do the gig, and you're done. So it's itinerant and it's on and off. So I have long stretches of time where sometimes I don't have a job for a while. It's not like a steady stream of income, but you supplement it. Sometimes I teach, but there is a lot of self-care involved because your body is your instrument. And I mentioned that I like hobbies where I don't use my voice, and gaming is one of those.
All right, well, let's get to it. Tough Beans by Sarah D. took 5th place in the 2005 comp and won the Zizzy Award for Best Player Character. You play a weak-willed young woman named Wendy Little, and the game opens by showing how the people in your life, and especially the men in your life, keep stepping in and insisting that you don't have the ability to do anything for yourself. In Tough Beans, which is named after a coffee shop in the game, you've gotten into a bit of a fix as you're late for work and you think your boyfriend may be cheating on you. And the game is about the extent to which you will use your ingenuity and your newly discovered backbone to get out of these scrapes. Right? More or less? Anything you would change or add to that?
No, that is a very good summary.
All right, so what'd you think?
I think it's really interesting that this won Best Player Character, because I think that the game did a really good job overall of making her personality infuse every single description that you get. Almost a little too much, actually, I would say. But like right from the get-go, you get a sense of who she is, of the type of person that she is. And it does kind of make you want to make her show a little bit of a backbone. It makes you want to say, oh, honey, come on, shape up your life. He's obviously cheating on you. You're obviously in a bad situation. So it's kind of her internal monologue. And you as a player, I think, are meant to kind of have enough of it after a while and want to make her shape up.
It's interesting that there even is an award for Best Player Character, just insofar as
Yeah.
I think it was F. Scott Fitzgerald who said that action is character. And in IF, the player chooses the actions that the player character takes.
Right.
I mean, obviously the author puts constraints on that, but still, you do end up with a medium in which protagonists are defined not by what they say or do so much as the way that, like, the descriptions of rooms and things are filtered through their perceptions.
And I think that's done very well in this game.
Hence the award.
Hence the award, exactly.
So I know neither of us have seen any of the competition yet, but it sounds like you're willing to give a thumbs up to this game winning the Best Player Character award?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it certainly put a lot of thought into the descriptions, and they're consistent in a way that was very satisfying. It was one of the only satisfying things about this game. It was very satisfying. Yeah, the problem that I had, and I believe you had this problem too, is that because she's struggling so much and because it puts her sort of meek, passive character into every description and seems to say in every description, this girl has really got to wake up and get her life together. This girl has really got to stand up for herself. She's got to do something to like change things and turn her life around. She's got to stop being a victim. Is that it seems to be very hard to do any of that in this game. Anytime I tried to rebel, the game would tell me that they didn't see any reason for me to do that, which got me very frustrated because it seemed like the game was telling me to do this. There's only one action that I can think of, the action that allows you to get coffee. The titular Tough Beans has a couple of places in it where you do something a little bit non-meek, and those are rewarded. But that's the only time I was able to get her to do anything really out of character for her.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you play Rameses from back in, I want to say, 2000?
I think I did, but gosh, I don't remember much of it. Can you remind me?
Yeah, the basic idea behind Rameses is that you play this boarding school student.
Right.
And the big innovation of the game is that your character wants to be like a man of action, someone who'll step in and tell off the bully and ask out the girl. But every time you type in a command to do any of those things, he always has some excuse for why that wouldn't be a good idea right now.
Right.
You know, you have a dialogue tree, and several of the options are full of like really sarcastic rejoinders to the insult you've just received. But if you pick any of them, the reply is something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, that would be an amazing thing to say."
Yes, I remember that. Oh my goodness.
But the point of that game, which is by Stephen Bond, I'm awkwardly going to add because I forgot to do so when I brought it up, is that there is no personal growth. At the end of the game, the player character is in the same spot he was in before. He's just transferred the focus of his daydreams from a brief childhood acquaintance of his to this girl that he just met and then ran away from. And it sounds like you're pointing out that Tough Beans has a similar mechanism in that the actions you try to take get batted down by the character's inhibitions, but the difference is that this is supposed to be a story of personal growth. Or to the extent that it's interactive, and there are a lot of different endings, the interactivity lies in the amount of personal growth that you can bring to the character. But it seems a little odd to have a game about a character learning to stand up for herself when what's actually happening is not that the character herself is actually learning anything or developing any willpower. It's actually the opposite, because her will is being taken over by the player.
Yes.
If she's standing up for herself, it's because we're telling her to do that.
Yes.
So instead of personal growth, it's effectively a story about a kind of demonic possession, and we're the demons, which raises the question of how an interactive story ever could be about personal growth.
I don't know. If the actions that you make the character take make the character realize, if the possession somehow changes the way the character starts seeing things, if it were reflected, I think, in the descriptions. And you get little hints of like her wishing for rebelliousness. I felt like whenever I tried to be rebellious or have a backbone or a will in the game, it was one of the dead end hints. So it would hint that you wanted to do this and you would do it, and it was a dead end hint. So you do that enough times and you get the feeling that the game doesn't actually want you to do that, even though it's hinting that you do.
You know, one thing that occurs to me is that in a game with puzzles, the story may be about a character solving those puzzles, but it's actually the player solving the puzzles. So, by the same token, the real trick for an IF author creating a game about personal growth would be to present a story that, by interacting with it, makes the player experience personal growth.
Yes.
Which, if you could pull it off, could conceivably put the therapy industry out of business. But that brings me to the puzzles in this game, and I was struck by the way that the game seems to want to be about choosing between being more passive and more spunky, I think is the word the walkthrough uses. But what you actually end up doing for big chunks of the game is the old-fashioned text adventure, find objects, and combine them to get through doors kind of puzzles. Like the first big set piece is about getting past your boyfriend's big dog, and it really is about wandering around, looking under sofas, and collecting random trinkets, and reading the author's mind to find out how to put them together, because, you know, you can't just find the dog food and feed it to the dog. That would be too easy.
Right.
And all in all, it seemed to have a lot more to do with being a character in an adventure game than it did about learning how to be spunky. The game sort of alternates between puzzles and character development instead of integrating them.
I feel like the character development, though, is mostly about text dumps. You solve a puzzle and you get a couple of screens of text before you can do anything again. It gives you little flashbacks, little insights into her life, which are interesting. but they don't have much to do with the action. So I think you're absolutely dead on as far as character action. Even though the descriptions still fit the character, any development that happens outside of any action that you might take.
So I don't want to obsess about this dog food puzzle, but it did sort of flag up a couple of problems that seem to me to afflict interactive fiction in general. One is that when you're playing a piece of IF, you usually spend the vast majority of your time using the same set of verbs. Verbs for moving around, for looking at things, for picking up and dropping things. But then the solution to the puzzle ends up being, there's even a term for it, guess the verb. You end up having to use one non-standard verb, and in this case it turns out to be shake. And in a way, that's the defining characteristic of IF, or, I guess now you have to specify parser IF. But the whole idea is that you can try typing anything. And I mean, probably the best known moment in any of my IF depends on the fact that, you have to try an unusual verb. And if that verb had been sitting in an on-screen menu the whole time, the moment wouldn't work. But here, you need a sound to distract the dog, and it just seems so arbitrary that the sound of emptying the dog food bag into the bowl wouldn't work, but shaking the bag would.
I actually had the opposite problem. I knew that I had to shake the bag, but I couldn't get enough items in it to make a good enough sound. And there was one object in particular that I couldn't find.
Which one?
It was the splinter.
Oh, yeah. I didn't need that one because I had enough objects already, but I saw it in the walkthrough and I was like, what?
Like, why would she do that? Why on earth would she ruin the floor even more just to get a splinter out? And you don't even realize that it's sort of pebbly dog food sized. There's no description of it.
Well, that brings me to the second thing I was going to bring up, which is that one of the big questions every IF author has to face in building a world is what to implement. It's one thing when you are like exploring the bare abandoned base that actually only has like 3 items in it. But it's another thing when you are trying to do something like this that's more of a slice of life type of game. You are in a house that you live in and you are looking for 3 objects to put into this bag. I'm thinking that there are 3 objects that are available without needing to look under sofas and move rugs around and so forth. Like, doesn't she have a junk drawer?
Or a handful of change.
Yeah, open the drawer, grab a fork, that'll
There a
that'll
box
do
of
the trick.
cereal in the cupboard or something.
Yeah.
For me, good IF is not just about good writing or clever puzzle crafting, but you have to have a good way of hinting at what the character needs to do. You're only interacting through text. There are no images. The only thing that the player has are the words you give them. If you don't give them what they need for what they do to make sense, and you're playing guess the verb, it gets frustrating for the player because it feels like they're giving everything and you're just waiting until they say the right thing. The best IF games, the ones that I really love, are the ones where once you hit on what the game is hinting for you to do, you feel very clever for having thought of it. I would not have felt very clever for having thought of pulling the splinter up. It seemed random and weird. And frankly, putting all the objects in the bag and shaking them seemed a little random and weird too. The rest of the puzzle solutions were a little more obscure and relied you on looking at the right thing, but that one especially felt really forced to me.
So speaking of the rest of the puzzle solutions, let's leave the dog food now. And I know that there was another puzzle that you wanted to talk about, so take it away.
There's one puzzle in particular, which is the elevator puzzle, that relies on you to solve it as fast as you possibly can. The buttons are off in some way and you have to figure out what's the correct button to press. There doesn't seem to be a way of doing that just by looking at the buttons because the way it's described is not very clear. But once you've played through the game once, you know what floor you're supposed to go to. So the idea is that you don't go to any of the other floors and that's how you score a point. There's something on every floor and there's something interesting on every floor. And it seems to me that the point of playing these games is to absorb all of the creativity that the creator poured into it. And so you're essentially being punished if you want to explore and see what every floor opens up onto.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are plenty of games that involve optimization puzzles where you have to learn how to do things efficiently in order to fit in all your actions before the bomb goes off or whatever. But this does seem a little different. I mean, normally you get extra points for finding the extra areas and seeing more of what there is to see.
Yep.
So to reward you for not finding those areas is an interesting experiment, and maybe the lesson learned is not to do this.
Also, if you're going to score, it might help the player to know where the scores happen. You know, if I'm on the right track, I like to be told I'm on the right track. And in this game, essentially, you're told you're on the right track when the game advances. And so I assumed that was how the points were being scored. But in fact, when you score points in this game, you get absolutely no notification whatsoever that you have done anything different from what you might have done, or that this particular action is more desirable than that other particular action. It seemed like a very odd and random way to allocate points.
Right. There are some people who don't like IF games to keep score at all.
Yeah, I really have a problem with games that have scoring systems.
Well, there you go. But even though they're artificial, they do sort of point out the track that you're supposed to be on.
Yeah.
You know, you pick up the fork and it says, okay, now you have a fork. And you pick up the screwdriver and it says, you pick up the screwdriver. Bing, you just received 10 points. That sort of tells you, I think I'm going to be using this screwdriver in the future.
Exactly.
Okay, we're just about at the end of our time here. So, any last thoughts about Tough Beans?
I just wanted to add one thing. What was the name of the other secretary that she had to get the signature from? Rhoda?
Rhoda, yeah.
I really liked Rhoda, and I wanted to see more of her, so let's have a game with Rhoda in it.
All right, I think we have time for one more, and that'll be Distress by Mike Snyder. And here to discuss it with me is another new guest, so take it away, Laura.
My name is Laura Hubbard, and I am a curriculum designer for a test prep company. My experience with interactive fiction and my interest in it definitely goes back to finding all of my sister's copies of her Choose Your Own Adventure books and playing through all of them over and over and over again. So most of the interactive fiction I started playing was definitely centered on that sort of framework. And I would say my interest in interactive fiction as a genre probably only goes back about a year and a half. But since I've really started exploring it, I have maybe played through a dozen or so titles.
So the ones you've played so far, are these mostly the more recent ones that I haven't played yet? Or did you start at the beginning with the 80s canon and the 90s canon?
I would describe my journey into interactive fiction as a drunkard's walk. It's pretty much Google and Wikipedia and whatever I come across that day. So I had the strange pleasure of having Galatea be my first interactive fiction that I actually played through.
That sounds to me like a great place to start.
It was an awesome place to start, but I think that because it was so good, sometimes I feel very disappointed in other places, and so I feel like I should have started at the beginning, but I didn't know that it was something that I was going to like, so I didn't know any better.
So, any game would find Galatea a hard act to follow, but let's see how Distress did. Distress by Mike Snyder is a short game in which you play the sole ambulatory survivor of a spaceship crash. You're trying to summon a rescue vessel. It took 4th place in the 2005 comp and won the Zizzy Award for Best Puzzles. I'm no good at puzzles, and so I ended up turning to the solution file pretty quickly. And in it, the author seemed kind of defensive about the extent to which his game is a throwback. You know, for one thing, you can die, and more to the point, you can quickly get yourself into an unwinnable state. This is definitely more text adventure than interactive fiction. And yet, there isn't really any adventure to it. There's almost nothing to explore, there's not much to play around with, the map is really tiny, and you're thrust into this emergency situation, and you can't really do anything except try to solve the puzzle that's right in front of you. And that's not really a lot of fun to me. So, was it to you?
Not incredibly. It's not something that's fun to me when there's only one solution. So one of the criticisms I had about Distress was that because you could get into an unwinnable state really quickly, And because there was one solution to every puzzle, there was no way to go around the puzzle. So parts of Distress made me think of D&D. But the difference between Distress and something like Dungeons & Dragons is that even if something is an incredibly puzzle-driven campaign, you can still kind of get around everything by brute force, or you can get around it by doing something really clever. There's always more than one way a puzzle can be solved. Because there was only one way, and because I knew that if I did not do this one way, I would just get into an unwinnable state. After I died, because I am terrible at saving, I would end up just memorizing, okay, in order to not die, up until this point, you're just typing in the same commands over and over. It's not really fun, and it doesn't really feel like you have a whole lot of control over where the story goes. It really reminded me of this Choose Your Own Adventure parody that I hated as a kid because I didn't know it was a parody. It was by this Australian author, Garth Nix, and he basically made this unwinnable game. And no matter what you did, you would die. Like, I actually went through and cheated on it and made an index of every possible way that you could go through it, and there's no way to win. And because I was very stubborn and really resisted looking at the solution file for Distress for so long, this reminded me of that a lot and of that frustration.
Do you remember what it was called?
You know, it might be on a shelf. I'm looking over there right now, and I know that it was in an anthology called Across the Wall.
All right. Well then, according to Wikipedia here, apparently it was called Down to the Scum Quarter.
Yes, that is what it was called.
All right, so I have another question for you. I decided to do podcast segments about the most acclaimed IF games of each year, rather than the ones that I thought would appeal to me the most, which means that so far it's been a pretty even mix of story games and puzzle games, and for most of the puzzle games, I end up having the same observation, which is that they tend to be thematically empty. And Distress is no exception. It's not about anything other than its puzzles and its plot twist. And the thing is, I like the genre. These sorts of survival and space stories normally do work for me. You know, they're great vehicles for portraying a character as sort of admirably plucky. But the player character in Distress is kind of a cipher. The walkthrough makes a big point of telling you to examine yourself, but all you learn is that you're inexperienced and that you're not bald. You don't get a name or even a sex. And the story is basically that you get some machines running, you fight a monster, and you learn the big twist, which is cool, but it's kind of like tying a pretty ribbon around an empty box. So, my question is, did you get anything out of the story as a story?
Other than a sense of fatalism? Not particularly. And what I mean by that is just the plot twist is, again, really the only story that you have, because even the actual puzzles and the events that do happen are fairly empty.
I guess that comment won't make a whole lot of sense without revealing what the plot twist is, so here's a spoiler alert. So it turns out that you've entered a region of space with time distortion, so that the distress call that you went to investigate before you crashed was your own distress call from after you crashed. And on the planet, you occasionally see phantoms of the past, and at the end, you see a phantom of the future, which is a rescue vessel that won't arrive for another 6 years, so you have to hold out until then. And I have to say, it's a cool twist, but it's the sort of cool twist that I would expect to see at the end of a segment on the 80s version of The Twilight Zone. And like one of the 5-minute segments that they used to tack on at the end, not one of the full episodes.
Right, and it's sort of a shortcut to closure. I felt so, I don't want to say disappointed, but I think that that's probably the right adjective for how I felt when it ended. I just kind of thought, oh, is this it? Is it over? And I had to read that last tableau a couple times to think, okay, yes, this is over. Yes, I feel a sense of closure, but I also feel like, as the character, I would have appreciated that echo from the future, knowing that I'm going to survive, probably, until the rescue ship comes. But as the player, felt like this person's story is just beginning. I really want to see how they deal with this totally alien environment that they've been put into and what it does to them as a person, rather than just knowing that, oh, they're going to get out one day. And I almost wish that we didn't have that closure, in that it's just them setting off into this planet and knowing that they have to explore the planet and leaving it open to say, okay, we don't really know whether or not they survive or not. And I almost would have been more satisfied with that, because I felt like just giving us that closure after the puzzles that you do go through is not particularly satisfying for me.
Yeah, one little piece of background here is that comp games are supposed to be playable from start to finish in 2 hours. A lot of authors just ignore that rule, but if you do follow it, well, the more time you expect your players to have to spend on your puzzles, the less story you can put in. I don't have much patience for puzzles, so I ended up going to the walkthrough pretty quickly, and therefore, I ended up blazing through this game because without the puzzles to slow things down, there's just so little there. And I've been wondering whether that closure you've talked about might have felt more earned to me if it had come after the end of a long struggle instead of a few minutes of reading.
I don't know that you would have gotten a deeper appreciation and a deeper sense of closure. I think you might have just been frustrated. Because that's how I felt. I still felt that I didn't have a very good sense of closure, and what closure the ending was trying to give me felt very cheap. And I really thought that the ending was cool, but I think that had this not been a comp piece, that it would have benefited from maybe a more expansive map. Even possibly without character development, just the more expansive map and a little bit more freedom to move around would have made this from I liked it, but I don't think I'll go back and play it again, to I really like this, I'll go back and look at this again.
I do want to say one positive thing about Distress, which is that the coding struck me as extremely solid. Pretty much every phrasing I tried was interpreted correctly, even in cases where it turned out that I had a different idea from what the author had in mind. There's a part where you have to tend to an injured crewmate with some ribbons of fabric after you've pulled a metal spike out of his shoulder. And according to the walkthrough, the suggested command was tie netting around shoulder. But I thought that I had to pack the wound, so I just typed put ribbon in wound, and it worked. And that's just one example. I don't think I hit any parsing snags. Did you?
I think I hit maybe 1 or 2 commands that I tried that just didn't work. But they were the sort of thing that you just type in without thinking sometimes, and you know it's too complex, and you hit enter anyway. And then looking at it, you're like, I actually have to make this parse in a way that a computer can understand. On the bandaging scene, I went completely the opposite direction from you, and I was just very general, and I said, just bandage wound. And it worked. So I would say it was incredibly versatile code, which, having struggled through coding a lot of things, really impresses me.
So I don't really have anything else to say about Distress. Did you want to add anything? I know that earlier you said that it reminded you of D&D. Did you want to expand on that or anything? Like, what parallels did you see?
There was definitely a feeling of creature has weakness, you can exploit said weakness, that's the way you can win, that's the only way you can win. And that was sort of D&D, because a lot of times, like in campaigns where you can have like a total party kill, that can happen, where, you know, you can definitely get out of a situation, but it's not going to be through brute force. So it kind of reminded me of D&D through that. And then the other thing was the running scenes always make me think of D&D, because in D&D you have a certain number of feet that you can move in a given turn. And so that's just the only thing that struck me there. I don't, have you played any like RPGs really?
I played Champions a few times in high school, and it sounds like the movement system is pretty similar, but I haven't really played D&D itself. Actually, a lot of what I know about D&D comes from just having played Necrotic Drift. Like, that's how I learned that when you encounter a skeleton, you're supposed to use blunt weapons.
Because piercing damage just doesn't work at him.
Yeah, everybody knows this but me. And I guess that's why skeletons killed my entire family. And that wraps it up for Radio K number 8. Thanks to my guests Claire Parker Fisher, Stacy Tappan, and Laura Hubbard, and to the authors of the games, Rob Sherwin, Sarah D., and Mike Snyder. And thank you for listening. Bye for now.